Okay, members, thank you very much. Welcome everyone to the committee, members of the public who are here, everyone on the webcast as well. Our main item for discussion today at the Housing Committee will be tackling hidden homelessness. Members of the public can follow the meeting on the webcast, and on Twitter we're using the hashtags Assembly Housing and Between Homes to show that we're talking about this issue. Please join the discussion. Please may I also remind our members and our guests and our audience to turn off their phones and put them on silent and not vibrate and things. Before we start the meeting, this is the first Housing Committee meeting we've had since the Grenfell Tower disaster. The full extent of the disaster is not clear yet, but I think it would be very appropriate for us now to stand and have a minute's silence for the victims, if that's all right with everybody. Okay, thank you everybody. So can I ask if any apologies have been received for the meeting?
Yes, thank you, Chair. Apologies have been received from Assembly Member Cooper and Assembly Member McCartney substituting for that today.
Thank you very much. Item 2 on the agenda is declarations of interest. Can I ask the members to note the list of officers on the report? We've got an updated report in the supplementary agenda. And do you have any additional interests to declare? No. Okay, thank you. Number 3 on the agenda is the minutes of the last meeting. Can I ask the members to confirm the minutes of the committee's last meeting, which was on the 23rd of March 2017?
Yes.
Thank you very much. It's confirmed. Item 4 is the summary list of actions. Can I ask members to note the completed and outstanding list of actions from previous meetings?
Noted.
Thank you. Noted. Item 6. This brings us to today's main item, a discussion on tackling hidden homelessness. Firstly, because our last meeting was a while ago, can I ask members to agree the focus of the discussion, which I'll just read out. We're discussing whether the homelessness system could be adjusted to take better account of particularly vulnerable groups who might currently not be accorded priority need. If so, how this could work. The extent to which the Homelessness Reduction Act may make visibly homeless people who are currently hidden homeless, and how young people in particular could be made aware of their entitlement to homelessness support and the advice services open to them, and what more the Mayor could do to advance this agenda. So now can I welcome our guests? We have Vincent Lowell, who is the Housing Solutions Manager from the London Borough of Southwark. We have Jenny Barnes, who is the Head of Policy and Research at Centrepoint. Deborah Halling, who is the Senior Policy Officer for Housing and Land at the GLA. And via the internet, we have Jenny Bibbings, who is the Campaigns Manager from Shelter Wales, and there's already been some work in this area. That's why we've brought her in especially today. So this is the second committee meeting we've had on the topic of hidden homelessness. Our first meeting in March, we heard about the nature and extent of hidden homelessness from a number of homelessness support services, and also from some people who've experienced hidden homelessness. We've launched a survey to gather some more detailed information, and we'll be using the survey data and the information we get from these 2 meetings to look at possible policy responses. So starting with our questions, Our first question is about definition of vulnerable persons. What we found is quite often the people who end up hidden homeless don't fit the category of vulnerability. So the question if we can start with Vincent and then move along the row, which I doubt whether Jenny in Cardiff can see us doing this, then to Jenny Barnes, then to Deborah, and then to Jenny Bibbings, if that's okay. So, starting with Vincent, can you set out for us the definition of vulnerable persons that the statutory agencies use at the present time?
With vulnerability, I always say the challenge legislation throws us is you've got a dictionary definition of vulnerability, but then you've got, so to speak, a legislative definition of vulnerability. So any homeless person will be vulnerable because they don't have somewhere to stay. They're vulnerable. But then when it comes to legislation, the definition is slightly different. You then go into things like, are they ordinarily vulnerable? Are they significantly more vulnerable? In terms of the Act as it stands, the Housing Act 1996, so you've got people who are pregnant, people who have children, people who are vulnerable as a result of old age, mental health, handicap, physical disability, people who will be considered vulnerable or in priority need. If you've been made homeless due to fire and flood also, so for example with the incident we had in West London recently, clearly they would all be classed as vulnerable. That was the Act, that was the Housing Act 1996. The Homelessness Act 2002 then made adjustments to that by adding a category of people. And I guess that's where, for some of those categories, they're clear-cut. So if you're 16, 17-year-old, you're vulnerable. If you've been looked after, you're vulnerable. Where it gets tricky is, did you become vulnerable by reason of a prison sentence? Did you become vulnerable by reason of serving in the armed forces? Did you become vulnerable by reason of domestic violence or domestic abuse? And that's where the contention is. And with case law, the judges have tried to redefine that to make it clearer, but unfortunately, that has still not, it's still not clear, because we've still got cases in courts in terms of, are you significantly vulnerable, are you ordinarily vulnerable, who do we owe a duty to? So that's where we are in terms of vulnerability. The latest case law on vulnerability is the Hutak, Johnson, and Kanu case, and instead of solving the problem, it's kind of made it a bit more complicated, I would say, in my professional opinion.
Can you outline how that is in a simple way, or is that
Okay.
to read the whole case?
So previously, councils will rely on what we call the Pereira test, which is if you're street homeless and you've got needs, you're likely to be at a higher disadvantage than somebody else who is just street homeless without needs. And trust councils, we pushed that to the extreme, like we always do. And then these cases, Kanu, Johnson, and Hotak went to court, and then the decision was made in 2015. And basically, the summary of the three cases was, with Kanu, it was that you need to take into consideration the equality impact, the Equality Act 2010, when you're considering a client's vulnerability, so you need to consider the 9 protected characteristics. With the Hutak case, it says if you might still be found non-priority if you're vulnerable, but you've got a wraparound support service which is consistent and will always be with you even if you become homeless. Of course, there's been lots of cases going back to court that, okay, are you sure that's what you really want? And then with the Johnson case, it says you can't use general data, like, okay, if 20 people are vulnerable, then you being vulnerable makes no difference. It's got to be on a case-by-case basis. So that's where we are. We thought that would resolve the issue around vulnerability, but it's just raised up more questions than answers, in my opinion.
So, in your experience, are you finding that some people who just by common sense, are definitely vulnerable, they're just failing to be supported? Is that leading to more people being turned away?
I'd say in terms of support, so for example, for SADC, we have schemes, private-rented schemes for single people, for families, and all of that. They might not, for some of those cases, yes, we might not have a final duty, which is provide social housing to them. But there are other schemes we employ or we try to use to try to help them prevent homelessness. But I guess bottom line, if councils are funded appropriately, less people will be homeless. That's my view. The less the funding, the more the homelessness. But then with the Homelessness Reduction Act, that's going to change things a bit. But then ultimately it will still depend on funding, I would say.
So if the definition expands, and if the Homelessness Reduction Act sort of does more to expand the number of people you have a duty to, what might the practical difficulties be for local authorities like Southwark?
I like the Homelessness Reduction Act. I feel it's a step in the right direction. Whether it's gone farthest enough, I don't think so. But at least we're heading in the right direction. We have a duty to try to prevent homelessness. We have a duty to take reasonable steps to relieve homelessness. But you've still got other issues around homelessness, which, unless they are tackled, we could accept duty to everyone. But we still have the issue of where do we place them eventually. So in SADC, for example, 3 years ago, we had 2,500 social lets. Last year, it was just 1,000 because it's drying up. So we've got more people staying on in temporary accommodation, waiting for social housing.
Sorry, those figures, 2,500
Social
new lets.
New tenancies.
So, okay,
social
and
tenancies.
then last year,
was just
1,000 new
1,000.
lets.
Exactly.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, so it's dry now. You've got people staying longer in temporary accommodation, and those are in cases where we've accepted duty. Now, with the new act, if we expand that and we accept duty to more people, it just means we still have more people staying on in temporary accommodation, waiting for that social let, which is drying up, which is why it's important we consider private rented sector as a solution. However, with welfare reform, benefit caps, cost of living in London, that's a massive issue for clients. You could find them a property and the property might not be suitable because it's not affordable. And that's a real challenge. So previously, a few years back, up until 2010, we could still find a few properties in London where the LHA matched the market rents. And once you find that, that's good. Client happy, we are happy, landlord happy. But now, even if, now we're not getting those. But even when you get those, with the benefit cap, the customer might not actually get the LHA rates, which then becomes a double challenge, which then means we'll have to think of other options. Either they stay on in temporary accommodation for longer till they get a social let, or they have to consider moving somewhere more affordable, which is a challenge because if you've got support needs, support network around a particular area, the last thing you want to do is move away from that area.
Can I move on to Jenny and ask what you think about those issues that have been raised around the definition of vulnerability and the practicalities of housing everybody when you do accept the duty, and what happens if it expands?
Sure. So, I mean, in terms of the vulnerability definition, I kind of agree with what you said. I think a problem in terms of practicality is often young people don't know what to declare, so they don't necessarily know what would count as vulnerability, and a lot of young people are often, they're quite nervous about going and spilling their heart out to someone that they've never met before, and so if they don't know that certain factors are relevant, they wouldn't necessarily think to raise them. And so that's certainly an issue with things like mental health. A lot of young people haven't been diagnosed at the point that they become homeless, so they wouldn't necessarily know that that's something to raise. And similarly with domestic violence, that's not always something that they're willing to talk about straight away. So it's certainly something that we tend to find out about further down the line.
Do we have some interference on the speakers?
Sounds like it.
Yeah, I think so. I'm not sure about it though.
Yeah, that is quite strange. Jenny in Cardiff, can we ask you to mute your sound if you've got a sound thing We'll ask you to unmute it when we want you to speak. Sorry.
We might, because we've got a bit of traffic outside the.
That's what it sounds like.
Yeah, is that okay? Let me see if I can mute it. One second.
Sorry. Carry on.
So in terms of the challenges in delivering duties, so with regards to young people in particular, there's definitely challenges around supply of where do you put them once you have accepted duties. For young people, probably the biggest factor is the shared accommodation rate. Young people under 35 now are entitled to a lower rate of housing benefit. So in the private rental sector, that just means their options are extremely limited. We're hopefully going to be looking at this issue to do some more updated research on it, but previous research has shown that only 1.5% of lets are affordable at the shared accommodation rate and has a landlord that's willing to let to someone on benefits. So that's a real issue. If you also add
1.5.
1.5.
1.5.
Are willing to let someone on benefits.
And have a
Is that how long?
And who are homeless.
no 1.5% who are willing to let someone on benefits, and the rent is affordable to someone on the shared accommodation rate. So that was before the LHA freeze made this issue worse. So we would expect that to be even worse now. So we find it extremely difficult to find suitable private rented sector properties for young people, as I'm sure local authorities do too. And with the shared accommodation rate being announced that that's being spread to social housing, that will also make it extremely difficult to find social lets that are suitable for young people, because they don't tend to be shared social units. And also the rate would mean that they had so little buying power that I think social landlords would also be nervous about letting to this group. So there is a real question about where do you put them. So in lots of areas there is supported accommodation available, but again the budgets for that have been cut. And in many ways, for some young people that might be appropriate. For some young people that don't have support needs, they do need an independent unit. So again, we come back to the impact of the housing market. They're not being independent units for them to move on to. So it will be a real challenge for local authorities when those numbers are growing and you're potentially bringing in more people that don't necessarily have the higher support needs but do have an immediate homelessness problem, and to be able to assist them to access somewhere that they can afford and that's suitable.
Should we move on to Deborah?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I've got a sort of huge amount to add to those comments around priority. I mean, I think sort of Vincent's summary of the kind of legal position is really helpful, and I think that's a fairly sort of broad grouping, and often I think difficulties arise where the application of that isn't very kind of sensitive, particularly in cases with young people and say victims of domestic violence, where kind of drawing that story out of someone is not necessarily straightforward. So I think that's the issue is probably more around implementation than definition. And there are certainly some really good examples of local authorities assisting those to whom they don't necessarily have a legal duty, sometimes around young people or sometimes around rough sleepers. But obviously the pressures on local authority budgets for running services and the sort of huge issues around supply and affordability of accommodation in London, compounded massively by welfare reform, and the particular impact, as Jenny was describing, of that on young people are a real challenge for local authorities who would kind of seek to be as kind of accommodating as possible in that definition of vulnerability.
Okay, so Jenny Bibbings in Cardiff, you can hear us still?
Yes.
And you haven't done great. Do you have anything to add to that? Is the picture different in Wales? Is Wales doing anything differently?
No. Well, we changed the definition of vulnerability when we brought in the Housing Wales Act 2014. And that was something that we were really keen to engage with Welsh Government on, because we had, historically all sorts of issues around vulnerability with our clients, echoing what my colleagues are saying before me. It's what we found is that it's often a very humiliating. Sorry, are you able to hear me okay?
Yes, yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So supporting our clients through making a homelessness application when they're having to prove vulnerability was something we were always very uncomfortable with, because you have to really draw out all the problems in someone's life, and really you're kind of focusing on these, you know, these aspects, these kind of weaknesses in someone's life, the problems that they've had, so that they are eligible for a service, you know. And we also observed that local authorities were spending a lot of resource on investigating vulnerability. So we were engaging with the Welsh Government around developing the Act, and we have a new definition now in Wales. It doesn't go as far as we would have liked it to have gone. I mean, in an ideal world, you wouldn't have to ration services, you know, according to vulnerability anyway. But the definition that we've now got in Wales is that a person is classed as vulnerable if they were to become street homeless, if they were less able to fend for themselves than an ordinary person who is street homeless. We would have liked it to have been the comparator to be with the ordinary person, because the ordinary person who's street homeless is already by definition more vulnerable than the average, but that's what we've got. However, you know, in practice, with this new system, with the prevention duty and the relief duty, what we find is vulnerability doesn't become a factor until much further on in the process. So, you know, vulnerability isn't formally considered until someone has been through the prevention duty and then through the relief duty. Only at that point is it taken into account. So it's generally speaking much lower in the mix in Wales now than it was before the law change.
That's really useful to know. I mean, I'm also a local councillor, and I totally agree with you that when somebody comes in to help you with housing, you have to ask them all these quite searching questions in order to try and see if you can find them some help. It's very, very difficult. So when under the Act, you're acting before they're homeless, and so it's just more of a case of trying to help before you have to get to that point of pushing down the vulnerability route.
That's right, and if they're actually homeless by the time they enter into the system, then local authorities, they're not supposed to spend a lot of time investigating priority need. They're just supposed to go on whether is someone apparently in priority need, and they're supposed to err on the side of caution in that judgment. But the emphasis is on using resources to help people and support people, not in carrying out investigations.
Okay, that's really helpful to know. Andrew, you wanted to follow up with some questions?
Yes, please. Just before we go on, what's the situation with regard to Mr. Lowell, vulnerability of ex-service people? Are they in a category of their own, or are they assessed separately?
With ex-servicemen, so for example in SADC, we give them a very high priority on the waiting list outside of homelessness. So they can bid for a property, because even if they approach us homeless and we accept a duty towards them, for example, they will be in what we call band 3, which is like a third category. So you've got band 1, the highest, band 2, band 3. If my memory serves me right, they'll be in band 2 once we know that they're ex-armed forces, and we've given them more priority, so they don't have them. So that argument around homelessness, are you in priority need or not, will not hold anymore.
Is that an approach that's shared with other boroughs as well?
Also, I was going to get to, different boroughs have different protocols around what they do with armed forces. The government did say that reasonable preference should be given to them, but then reasonable preference as defined by each local authority is different. So for us, it's give them a higher band. For some, it might be give them a priority star, give them, I don't know, other things.
Thank you for that. Now, I'll just move on to my main question. Again, Mr. Lowell, what training officers, what training do your housing officers undertake for dealing with victims of domestic violence and abuse in determining their vulnerability?
Every year, all our staff go through at least a minimum of 2 trainings around domestic violence, domestic abuse. We have officers within the service who are domestic violence champions. So, who would, once a client comes in and the new client is being domestic violence or domestic abuse, they engage with such clients. We, as a council, we fund the Domestic Violence Women's Aid, Solace, to work with us to provide support to victims of domestic violence. We co-locate our services with them. So every Wednesday, they're coming into our service and they bring in the list of cases they have. We bring in the list of cases we have. We compare notes. We try to move things forward. We do joint presentations at MARAC in terms of clients who are high risk and in terms of the solutions we can provide to them. So lots of training, I would say. We're quite robust in terms of the service we have for domestic violence.
And the training that is received, who gives that training?
So Solace Women's Aid provide the training. Recently, DAHA, is a Domestic Abuse Housing Alliance or something like that. Sorry, I can't remember the full. They also have come in and provided training to us at least twice around domestic violence.
And that's in the whole range of domestic violence?
Yes, domestic abuse.
Domestic abuse in
it's
general.
more domestic abuse now, not domestic violence.
Do you think there's any more that's required in terms of training or understanding of domestic abuse by how?
I think so. I think we always, yeah, definitely. That's why for us the training is ongoing. So it's not like every year we get more officers to become domestic abuse champions. I attend the Violence Against Women and Girls quarterly meeting, where we discuss issues like this also. So yeah, definitely, officers need to be trained more and more. With housing, budget cuts means officers come, officers go. So unless you keep on training them, you're likely to lose your experienced officers if they find job elsewhere or they take redundancies and things like that. So yes, I totally agree.
And perhaps to the other guests, to Jenny Barnes, is your experience that local authorities do understand domestic violence?
I mean, I think, as with everything, it depends on the local authority and it depends on the individual staff member. So some of them are extremely good at handling it. Unfortunately, we do hear cases where it's been handled badly. Like we still hear cases where young people are told they need a police crime number just to show they've reported the domestic violence to the police, which is not required, but that is still being asked sometimes of young people. So I think there is growing acknowledgement within local authorities that this is a big issue, but unfortunately we do still hear cases of it not going as it should. So, as with everything, I think, as you mentioned, continued training is required. There's still work to do.
Yeah, thank you for that. Thank you very much.
Joanna has a follow-up question.
And I'm asking it because I don't see anywhere else to put the question, so I apologise. But when I talk to people that work in domestic violence refuge, what I'm often told is that there's lots of insecurity, particularly in social housing, because quite often the security of tenure resides with the perpetrator, and that a lot of what women, and particularly women, but obviously also men, say is that if something could be done so that when they left a property, they either don't lose their own security of tenure, that they're not intentionally homeless, particularly if they can't prove domestic violence. Secondly, if the tenancy agreement is in the name of their partner, ex-partner, that whether there should be a mechanism so that can be allocated to the person that has fled, and particularly women with children, most of them. They might not want to go back to that particular property, but then they could at least look to exchange it. So that's an issue. I'm just wondering whether that's something that has been flagged up and whether you'd welcome some change that would enable you and your social housing to actually reallocate tenancies on that basis.
I totally agree with you. One, for us as a council, again, I can only use SADC as an example, that's all I know. If a tenant, a secure tenant, a council tenant is fleeing domestic violence, one of the provisions we have through our allocations policy is to place them in the highest band, which is band 1 for emergency transfer.
But do they retain their security of tenure? Because often they fear they're going to lose it and have to start again.
Yeah, so they retain their security of tenure because they're moving from one social tenancy to another. So they still remain, they still keep their security of tenure. Lately, we've been more active in terms of the London reciprocal arrangements, where they're actually able to move to another borough and still retain their security of tenure. The bit we as, and I'm speaking as Sola, but the bit we as Homelessness and Housing Solutions don't like is, of course, the case you mentioned, where someone's moving out with children and we can't just kick out the perpetrator from the property just like that, because as far as we are concerned, that's a breach of their tenancy. Just kick them out, give the property to the lady, or give the lady something else and give that property to another person. I've been told that they've gone to court a few times to try to make that happen, but judges are sometimes reluctant to grant that request, which then makes it difficult for them to enforce. That's what I've been told. But if we had our way as Housing Solutions, of course, if someone's fleeing a property due to violence, the perpetrator shouldn't remain in the property.
Particularly if children are involved.
Particularly if children are involved, yeah. We've had a few cases where they've been able to go to court and change the tenancy to the woman's name, where the woman wasn't originally on the tenancy agreement, but you'd expect those cases to either be something consistent, something which is just by default something you do, or eventually, either way, evict the perpetrator. But I wouldn't say that's happening as much as it should at the moment. And I think that's across local authorities.
Jenny Bibbings had her hand up to answer, I think, that question as well, from a Welsh perspective. Is that right?
Yes. Just briefly, just to highlight that, I mean, this is an issue in Wales as well, and Welsh Government has recently brought in some new legislation. It hasn't been implemented yet. It's called the Renting Homes Act 2016, and it's all about simplifying tenancy law, and it's along a framework which was developed by the Law Commission going back quite a few years now. One of the provisions in that is creating joint tenancies, so that you can remove people's name from the tenancy, you can add new people's name onto the tenancy as well. You could end up at the end of a tenancy having completely different people listed as contract holders than they were at the beginning, and the policy aim here was specifically to deal with these issues around domestic abuse, where the tenant's name is, the perpetrator is named in the tenancy. So that's coming in autumn 2018, so we'll wait and see how it works out, but we're hoping that it will make things easier for victims of domestic violence.
Thank you.
A quick one, and that's to Deborah actually. So I understand the Mayor's given some extra money in the homelessness money, particularly about women that are at risk of domestic violence, about refugees.
Within the overall affordable homes programme, so the 3.15 billion for affordable homes between 2016 and 21, there is provision there to fund the development or refurbishment of refuges. I think probably what you're referring to is 50 million that's set aside for move-on accommodation for those who are in a position to move on from either hostels or refuges. I know my colleagues who are working on that fund have been having conversations with Women's Aid and other organisations about the kind of best ways to develop that. So that wouldn't necessarily be social rented accommodation, but it could potentially be.
Thank you.
How many refugees are there in London? Because I know the policy during the last administration was not to concentrate on refugees.
I don't have that kind of figure at my fingertips, but I can find it out. We have got it kind of squirreled away, so I can find that and bring back to you. I think there is slight under provision within London compared to
we have,
the rest of the country.
We asked for some data on this following our last meeting,
and
I think that's come back. It will be in our report when it comes.
That's good, because I remember over the last, last period, last administration, we've been very concerned that the emphasis good enough. You know, it's good. It was on rape crisis centres, but completely moved away from refuge provision.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of part, there's a need for sort of a mixed economy of provision, and the ideal is to kind of intervene early, and that's why I think Vincent mentioned the Domestic Abuse Housing Alliance, which is working with social landlords to help them kind of identify and support victims early on, and hopefully avoid those kind of eviction type situations that you were talking about. But refuges are kind of a necessary part of provision, and that's why the Women's making funding available for them.
Thank you, that's helpful.
Okay, moving on, I think Tom Copley. I'm saying everyone's full names now so that Jenny in Cardiff knows who you are. Tom Copley has questions.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, well, my question is to Vincent. What kind of housing options, advice can local authorities offer to those who might need support but aren't owed the main homelessness duty?
I'll go back to something I said before, which is when there is funding to local authorities, we create options with the funding. Once the funding dries up, it's just back to the legality of assessing people and making decisions. So, for example, in Southwark, at the moment we're a trailblazer borough for the new Homelessness Reduction Act, and we've been given some money by the government to pilot the Homelessness Reduction Act. And with that money, we've been able to set up a lot of schemes for single people. And part of those, so one of those schemes, for example, is what we call Housing First scheme. With Housing First scheme, we know lots of single people with complex mental health needs will not sustain or maintain their accommodation. You could place them because they're in priority need, but then it breaks down and they're back on the streets. So we're running a bespoke service for them where we have an officer. So
is this the same as the housing? Essentially the same as the Housing First that they have in New York, which
yes, exactly.
Yes,
yeah, exactly.
It's that scheme.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So we're bringing that in because we've got the money for it. We're bringing in incentive schemes to help single people into alternative accommodation. We also have an accommodation finding service within the council, which is our PRS procurement team. They also try to help people with alternative accommodation. We're bringing in family reconnection officers who would go back where there's no violence, speak to mom, speak to dad, speak to grandma, to try to prevent homelessness and keep people in their accommodation, because that's part of what we're meant to be doing under the Homelessness Reduction Act. And a few other schemes like that. But I guess what I'm trying to say is, once the funding is there, it's easy for local authorities to bring about schemes, employment, debt advice, all kinds of schemes to help people. When the funding dries up, it becomes difficult.
I'd love to ask you more about this, but I know there's going to be questions on the Homelessness Reduction Act later, so I don't want to chat on that. I mean, our survey that we did on hidden homelessness found 57% of those who replied didn't go to the local authority in many cases because they didn't feel the local authority would be able to offer them anything.
Systems.
I mean, actually, do you think that is actually a correct assessment? You wouldn't be able to.
Yeah, I think so. I think so. As a local authority right now, we expect that over time we're going to get an increase in the number of people approaching us for assistance because we brought these schemes in to help them. Because we work with agencies, we work with local people, and they know the service provision. They know that at the time when we didn't have the money, there was really little we could offer people at the time, other than we've assessed you, we have a duty towards you, we don't have a duty towards you, you can try to find an accommodation to rent, but we can't help you with the deposit because we don't have the money. But that's changed now because we've got some money to do all of that. So I would say yes, 57% of people people not going to their local authorities because they feel they're not going to get any help is accurate, I would say.
I don't know if our other guests want to sort of comment on whether or not you think there is more local authorities could be doing, or whether you simply agree that they're so overstretched that they can only really focus on those who are entitled to a priority need. Jenny, do you have any thoughts on that?
I mean, I think it's undeniable that in order to do more, they probably need more resources. So there's certainly the pockets of good practice show that if improved training and improved focus can improve the service on the ground. A lot of it is about how the initial person when you walk in the door receives you. So I mean that sort of stuff I think can be improved. But in terms of practical assistance that local authorities can be delivering to people that present, unfortunately that does cost money. So you can't really escape that fact, unfortunately.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would agree with both Jenny and Vincent that there are things you can do with good training in terms of making sure you pick up people who are vulnerable, making sure you deliver on the legal duty, but it is difficult for local authorities when resources either aren't there, or I think what often local authorities will say is that there are kind of short-term pockets of funding. So Vincent, for example, mentioned kind of homelessness prevention trailblazer funding. So there can be a period where there are some really good services that are in place. And those often have some kind of positive sort of trickle-down effects, but it's very difficult, I think, to sustain provision. And that partly, I think, is about kind of funding for services through local authorities, but there is also an issue of what the wider housing market looks like. So, you know, even with the kind of best funded housing options services in the world, with the current housing market and the impacts of welfare reform on that could be very difficult to deliver substantial housing options for people. And another factor there is the kind of uncertainty that's surrounding supported accommodation at the moment. So I think that's something that some local authorities have been really good at delivering kind of pathways for their supported accommodation to help, for example, young people or rough sleepers. And those, I think, are in a very kind of precarious position at the moment because both revenue funding for the support and for the housing costs is very uncertain at the moment.
And just finally, I wanted to ask Jenny, in Wales, when the definition was changed, presumably encompassing more people, did resources follow that when that definition was changed, that local authorities had more to be able to deal with the extra people? Oh, the sound's gone.
Perhaps she's muted herself.
There we are.
I put myself on mute and I forgot to right. So Welsh Government put some additional money in place, transitional funding, and it was meant to be there for 3 years initially, and it was tapering year on year, and the idea was that local authorities should be able to manage demand themselves on their normal budgets moving forward. But what we have found in practice is that is impossible actually for Welsh local authorities, and so there's been a strong lobby to Welsh Government with us and with local authorities as well, all saying the same thing, which is you need to resource this agenda in a long-term way. An example of that was that local authorities in Wales, before the Act came in, some of them had prevention funds, but a lot of them didn't have the money to put prevention funds in place. And those prevention funds have actually been a very important part of helping them to meet their duties under prevention and relief. We've seen prevention funds being used in all kinds of very innovative ways, it has to be said. Sometimes it's about clearing arrears, sometimes it's about just little things that people can't afford, like paying the £50 court fee to make an application to suspend a warrant, you know, or paying someone's bus fare so that they can get to the emergency accommodation, all sorts of things like that. But that money is very important, and if the Welsh Government weren't providing additional assistance, those prevention funds in many cases would disappear. So it's a focus for our lobbying moving forward that we need to make sure that this agenda is properly resourced.
Thank you.
Great. Nikki Gaffron would like to ask some questions at this point, I believe.
Yes. Can I just, Vincent, can I just ask you, is there still, does the government still give a supporting people's grant?
They do.
They do. And do you ever use, because that's discretionary, isn't it? You can use it for vulnerable people. Is that ever used in these cases?
Yes. Because in Southwark we've still got supported housing provision for clients who are vulnerable due to mental health, drug, alcohol, and all of that. I must say the funding is reducing drastically, so which again creates a challenge. And also, I guess the biggest challenge we have with supported housing provision is we're at a stage now where there's a lot of bed blocking. So you have people in supported housing who are meant to move on, so other people can move in, but the challenge is where do they move on to? The private rental sector market is not affordable,
Sure.
and social housing is no longer there.
Sure.
So we've got lots of people just bed blocking in our supported housing schemes. Yeah.
And the supported housing funding isn't ring-fenced.
Sorry?
The supported housing funding isn't ring-fenced, so
Yeah.
they don't have to spend it on housing-related support.
And I think it's really noticeable that since the ring fence was removed from that funding in, I think about 2010 or
Yeah.
thereabouts,
Yeah.
the amount of investment nationally in
Yeah.
supported housing has
It's dropped.
gone down massively.
So it's used for other things by local authorities?
Yes.
Hmm.
So
Not vulnerable
everywhere.
people?
Not everywhere. So in some places they have continued to maintain their level of funds, but I mean in some areas the amount spent has dropped by like 85% because
By 85%?
they've needed to kind of, not necessarily in London, I think most of the examples of the big cuts have actually been outside of London, but they've then, because there's so many other pressures on their budgets, local authorities have decided not to provide that housing related support anymore and spent that money on other things which they are entitled to do now under the new local authority funding.
And I think it's also fair to be clear that although that money is no longer ring-fenced and can therefore be spent on other things, the total amount of the money year on year has been subject to reductions.
Yeah.
So it's partly about spending on other things, but partly about just not having the same amount
Enough.
to spend.
I see, I know, but still, this is a budget for vulnerable people.
And it may well be spent, I mean, you would have to look at different authority budgets, so it may well be spent on services for vulnerable people, but not necessarily on supported accommodation. So it can be
Sure.
spent
And not
differently.
necessarily on homeless people, so
Yeah.
it might be
Yeah.
Yes.
for
Care
All right.
older
services,
people, for
social
example.
care.
I just think, Chair, it might be worth us looking at that. I just want to move on to what I was supposed to be asking, which is, this is of centre point.
Mhm.
Jenny, what advice do you give to young people when they come to you?
You were talking to our help with regards to our helpline. So we have a range of different services. So some of it, the vast majority of what we do is supported housing provision. So most of that comes through the local authority. So the advice we provide to them is about developing a personal support plan for them, helping them access education and dealing with any health issues that they have. I imagine your question is in regards to the helpline and what advice we give young people when they present to that. Is that right?
Well, no, I just generally, but I mean, how long's your helpline been there?
So it's quite a new service. It's formally launched in February. So
This February?
yes.
Oh, so it's very new.
Yes. So this was essentially a service that came out of demand that was coming to us anyway. So we were having lots of calls to our main head office number from young people who were asking for housing advice, basically. And so we decided that this had been going on for a number of years and we needed to formalise our response to these calls. So we created a prototype last year, but it formally launched in February this year. And primarily what we do is helping young people understand what their entitlements are. So it's not a detailed advocacy service. All we can do is make them aware of what priority need is, issues that might be relevant if it applies to them. In many cases, it's just telling them to go to the local authority because while it's an obvious thing to lots of us, they wouldn't necessarily know that local authorities do provide housing assistance. So sometimes it can just be go and speak to your local authority, you might be in priority need, it's worth making a homelessness application. These are some of the factors that would make you priority. If this applies to you, make sure that you raise that when you go down so they're kind of aware of the relevant information they should be providing. We also hold information on what local voluntary services are available in their area. So if they tell us where they live, we've got a database that we can look up and provide them with information about whether it's a detailed local advocacy service or if there are any direct access services in their area, we can make them aware of those too. So it's very much a signposting service really to deal with what we've found to be really quite big gaps in young people's knowledge about what services are out there and what they're entitled to.
So it's supporting them, giving them advice, and signposting.
Yeah.
But that's it. Yes, okay.
Yeah, so in an ideal world it shouldn't be necessary, really, but unfortunately we've found that it is, that young people don't necessarily know what it is that they should be raising, or what services are out there for them, so...
Sure.
Yeah.
Do you think, this is to Deborah, do you think the Mayor could be doing more in terms of messaging and educating and advising?
Potentially, I think there is some role there, and I know that the Mayor is very supportive of the centre point phone line that Jenny was just describing. I think some of the sort of complexity of the picture in London is that the legal duty, as we've discussed, for assisting homeless households sits with London boroughs, and they have a sort of pan-London service, previously known as the London Youth Homeless Gateway, and I think the name of that has just changed, and I don't have the new name to hand, that they will all be part of, and that is funded through London councils. So I think there is some kind of provision there at a pan-London level. So I guess there's something that the Mayor can do in terms of messaging and awareness raising, but there is a sort of case about where the legal responsibility sits and what's already in place.
Yes. You've got a housing portal, haven't you? A property portal. Have I got this right? It's a property portal.
There's a website at the moment that's used primarily for shared ownership properties, and there's some work underway to kind of broaden that.
You couldn't be using that to do more.
I mean, I think the remit of that is more around advertising intermediate.
Is this the
housing.
First Steps website?
Yeah.
That's the one you're referring to, yeah.
Rather than advice giving.
Is there anything, any portal anything he's got that could be a vehicle?
I mean, I guess in terms of a vehicle for advice, there's something about sort of whether it would be helpful for the Mayor to be kind of weighing in with additional advice when that's not sort of something necessarily within the Mayor's remit, rather than looking at ways of best supporting local authorities and the kind of partnerships in which they work to do that more effectively. So I think some of the things the Mayor's doing can really help with that. So, for example, there's Platform for Life funding programme to develop more supported accommodation for young people, and that sort of thing can mean that there are some substantial options in place. But essentially, I would have some kind of hesitations about kind of muddying the waters with kind of legal responsibility for giving advice.
Yeah, but it could be signposting, couldn't it? I don't know. I think sometimes just having that voice and the Mayor being able to, the Mayor's there, being the Mayor, stretching the envelope, sometimes makes a big difference.
And I think
and
things
people,
like
we've just
supporting
heard it,
phone
it's so
lines.
fragmented across boroughs.
Yeah.
It's so different, the priority bands in each borough, and it would be quite good to just have, a message about what you can do, what can be done.
Sorry, Joanne had her hand up a minute ago. I don't know whether that was a point of information.
Well, it was just asking, apologies if you dealt with this in the earlier meeting, but common sense dictates that prevention is, apart from being a moral good, actually saves money in the long term. And I'm just wondering what assessment is being taken place of the Trailblazers scheme or in Wales to determine what is good practice and what is actually going to offer real value for money. Is that a sensible question to ask?
Unless what Tony wanted to ask was more of a point of information on this particular topic.
It
Do
is
you want to
really.
go ahead? And
I mean,
then
I think where I often struggle here, being a Year 2 GLA member, is if I don't know how the system works, how are the people that really need to access it? And almost I'd ask Jenny and her team if she can almost stand back and, on a page of A3, as I often do, put out a flow chart of who does what, local authority, which bit. You talk about London councils, we all know what London councils is. Anybody watching this podcast probably doesn't know what London councils even is. So it's who does what, London councils, the local authorities in London, is there a role, asking Nikki's question, for the mayor in terms of guidance or signposting? Because it just needs to be clearer, more transparent, and then we can perhaps make progress. Thank you.
Okay. Should we put your question
Yes.
out there now? Yeah.
What works, and are you
Yeah,
evaluating?
about assessment and
What
evaluation.
works?
What
Okay.
works, and are you evaluating?
Right. So we're trailblazing the Homelessness Reduction Act, and like Jenny said from Wales, we've started trying to assist people and putting aside the priority need, intentionality issues, which previously would have been a factor.
Yeah. I don't want to get into the later questions, but it's just, is it being evaluated? That's what I really want to know. And has there been evaluation done on prevention schemes in the past that could be drawn on? It's always, we're always doing this circular thing, and we never seem to learn from what's gone before.
I think in terms of evaluation, maybe I'm not getting the question straight, but it's either we're trying to help people stay where they are, or we're trying to provide them with alternative accommodation. Previously, we've had challenges with people coming in either at the last minute or when they are homeless before they seek assistance. Now, in Southwark, we've seen people coming in a lot earlier, which has been very, very useful for us, because it means they're still somewhere, and then we can help, we can engage with landlords, we can visit. We had a case 2 weeks ago where a lady was in rent arrears and she was due to be evicted, and we met with the landlord and we decided to pay £2,400 to the landlord to keep the tenancy on for a year. That didn't cover the whole arrears, but it got us a new tenancy agreement, because the alternative to that, as it was previously, was the client will come in as homeless, intentionality. Yeah, exactly. They will probably be in a temporary accommodation, which will cost us way more than the 2,400. And if we do then decide to assist them, we'll probably pay another £3,000 to another landlord to rehouse them. So it's schemes like that that are beginning to come out, and but these are early days. So I don't think we've actually had time to like sit down and like, okay, how many preventions have we had? What impact is it having?
Has this happened in Wales yet, in terms of evaluation?
Yes, it's still relatively early days in terms of evaluation. I mean, we've done some work around evaluating people's experiences and looking at the data. The Welsh Government has commissioned a full longitudinal evaluation, which is about midway through at the moment, and I think that is going to be, it's going to throw up some really interesting findings around the effect on people representing, because I mean the work that we've done certainly suggests that people feel that they're being helped more effectively. Not everybody, I have to say. You know, some people, particularly non-priority, aren't always getting their kind of the root issues which are causing their homelessness to be addressed. Some of the interventions do look like a bit of a sticking plaster intervention, I have to say. So I'm particularly interested to find out what happens over time, and do we see people representing a few months. But at the moment it's still early days, and we'll have to wait for that information.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, go on.
Just on the, you were mentioning, Vincent, the Trailblazer funding that you're using to kind of pilot some of the provisions of the Homelessness Reduction Act. Now, my understanding from conversations with DCLG is that evaluation is kind of built into that funding, and that all the way through they want to be evaluating that. I mean, I guess also there are a number of reports which I can certainly kind of forward on the costs of not preventing homelessness. So those, I think, provide some good evidence. I think what we do see is that some of the difficulty arises from the fact, and I don't know whether there's some kind of learning from Wales on this, but that sometimes where savings result from helping someone, the savings will accrue to an agency other than the local authority. So, for example, someone doesn't end up in prison or doesn't end up making heavy use of A&E because they're sleeping on the streets and very kind of prone to illness and injury. So the difficulty there is that when public funding isn't looked at in a kind of total pot, you sometimes get one agency making savings and the others having to kind of spend to deliver savings to them, which just doesn't stack up on budget sheets.
Yeah, I was going to make exactly the same point actually. So we did a cost-benefit analysis of our support, and the big savings were to the benefits bill, to criminal justice, and a small amount to health. So those are obviously not savings that local authorities see directly. So with regards to young people, the main prevention service that we have looked at is mediation services. And they have basically from the evaluations that do exist, they suggest that it can have a massively positive impact on the young person, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they go home. So if they can rebuild that relationship, but not necessarily living at home, that will improve their long-term outcomes and improve the chance of them moving into education and work, but doesn't necessarily mean that they're not in the short term needing to be supported by a local authority. So then asking the local authority to fund that service when the benefits are to other agencies, that's not necessarily always been a successful ask, unfortunately.
So I wanted to follow on with some questions now, which actually do follow on really well from the questions that Nikki was asking. As I understand it, Southwark has in its housing strategy an aim to work with schools and colleges to educate children and young people about housing, homelessness issues. And obviously one of the things we found was that people were not even approaching local authorities because they just didn't have the knowledge about that. So can you tell us how your borough staff are doing that work to engage with schools, voluntary groups, to get homelessness prevention into?
We've not done a lot on that yet.
Right.
At the moment, we're trying to do what we've called predictive modelling. So, for example, around 35% of those who approach us as homeless come from their parents' accommodation, parents, families, and relatives. That's the biggest reason compared to the rest of London, where it's short-term tenancy evictions, which is like 50% on average for the rest of London. So in Southwark, short-term evictions is just around 29% in terms of people coming in for assistance. So the big one for us is parental eviction. And we know that we've got
35% of your presentations are parental
eviction. Are parental eviction.
Amongst young people or across the board?
Across the board.
Wow.
Across the board, yeah. So that's why we're trying to invest in getting family reconnection officers who will then go in and try to get to the bottom of why that is such a big issue in Southwark. Of course, we know one of the reasons for that is parents are waiting, bidding on the waiting list for this property. They're not getting it. The bidding time is taking longer. And because the families are overcrowded, over time, they ask the young person to leave. So it's in engaging with the parents and engaging with the young people. And that's where we're focusing our attention on right now. And we're hoping if we get that right, then that can then help us to target the schools we need to go into and then provide presentations and work with them more in preventing homelessness.
Okay, well, thank you for that. That's really interesting. Can I ask Jenny Barnes what level of engagement you're doing with local authorities and schools? I know you're obviously the new helpline is really focused on young people. What are you doing there to get people to use it?
So, as it's fairly early days, we are doing another big push of advertising later in the year. So hopefully that we'll be able to provide some more detailed feedback later in the year. In terms of schools specifically, it's not something we're doing with regards to the helpline, but it's something we've done in the past. We have had programs where essentially we train young people to go into schools and run sessions about homelessness to try and break down some of the stigma around homelessness, get the young people to actually understand what it can be in reality, and in some cases recognise that in themselves, that could be a risk for them. It had really positive feedback when we delivered it, but unfortunately it's not something we do on any scale anymore. There's the odd ad hoc session. The challenges are funding, so it's a difficult thing to get funding for. And also, we also had problems with schools having too much else to focus on, to be honest. So with the schools that were likely to be requiring this the most, they didn't necessarily feel they had time on their timetables to be running these kind of sessions. The ones that were approaching us were often actually the more affluent schools that wanted to run a kind of charity session, busting stereotypes type sessions, which is obviously valuable in a different way, but in terms of direct homelessness prevention is trickier. So it's certainly something that we support and that we think should be more widely done, but I guess it's linking the kind of local authority agenda with making sure it's also a priority for schools in terms of what they're being judged by and the pressures that are being put on them as well.
Sorry, just one quick question. Is schools the right place though? I mean, surely it might be college. If we're talking about evictions, you probably wouldn't get that until you were over 18. Would it be better to work with colleges or?
So, I mean, it's definitely, if you're talking about, so the vast majority of the young people that come to us, it's about family breakdown, so that does start early. So I think there is definitely a role for, to be honest, I can't see who else can do it other than schools to reach the spread that's needed. It's certainly not the only answer. So yes, we have also worked with colleges, and certainly there's a big question about social media. So a lot of the work we're going to try and do with the helpline is around trying to access the networks that young people are using, to try and advertise it in those kind of spaces rather than kind of our traditional ones.
Do you find, because we're doing this investigation into what we're calling hidden homelessness, people who are between homes, do you find that there is the level of understanding that if you're sleeping on someone's sofa and you're technically a homeless person, even if you're just squatting around on different people's sofas, that's your status is that of being homeless and you are entitled to some help potentially. Is that something that young people in your experience understand or not?
Certainly not all of them, no. So young people that we're currently supporting say that they didn't realise they were homeless at the time. It's certainly not a tag they want to give themselves, so there is still a very stereotypical view of homelessness among the public, that it's drunk on park bench, so that's not a view of them themselves that they want to have. But certainly from previous surveys that we've done with a general population of young people, it's suggesting quite low numbers would know where to go for help if they were homeless, so I think there is quite a low level of awareness. Because for many young people, it's just not something that's ever come up from them. It's never been discussed. So if there is not this kind of, sort of level of education, it's not something that they would think to investigate, I suppose. It's obviously something that no one hopes to come across in their own personal experience. So if we're not actively offering that information to young people, I think it's hard for them to know the realities and where to go for help.
Vincent, if you want to answer.
We've had a few meetings with support workers who work with teachers in schools to talk about homelessness, but we've had presentations directly with students and all of that. I remember years ago, I used to go to schools, and one of the challenges we had then, apart from the school, like you rightly said, being busy, where do we put you on, what time can you come in to deliver this session, 30 minutes out, off you go. One of the challenges, and we saw an example actually of the challenge when they told us, were cases where probably somebody's left school and they're pregnant, they've had a child, and they bring the child back to school, and then they tell their mate, oh, this is my baby, I've got my own council place. It almost like erases all your efforts in trying to educate people that, look, homelessness is not help. It's not going to help you either in the short term or long term. Let's try to focus on our studies. Let's try to build good relationships at home. So I do know the schools we went to at that time had, and this was a few schools, had that challenge. That, look, yes, you've come in, because we were asking for feedback at the time. That, okay, is this working? Really speaking in schools and all that. No, yeah, it works until someone comes in with a baby and tells them, yeah, we've got our own council place. We're living by ourselves. We're independent now, and it's almost like, oh, that's a goal to want to aspire to.
Okay, so but earlier on we heard the problem was people weren't approaching councils enough. So that's possibly not quite the issue that's current today. People don't, I mean, my experience of young people is they don't realise that they should ask for help, that this idea that if you have a baby, suddenly you get a house, that's kind of gone away a bit. Is that, I mean, you were talking about the past then, weren't you?
Yeah.
So do you know what the situation is now with that?
I think now, I don't, well, like I said, in Southwark, for example, if people know that they're not likely to get any assistance, they're less likely to come in through our doors. So, yeah. But I guess if you know you're going to get an assistant, then you're likely to come in.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah.
It's very much in the sort of urban consciousness, that thing about if you get a child, you will get a home. It's still there.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
I remember saying that outrageous thing back in the early 80s. I was accused of being fascist. That was in some ways.
I'm slightly worried we might. This may. Gerald, did you want to say something about them?
I just think teenage pregnancy rates have dramatically
dropped.
dropped
They've
so
dropped.
much.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure that's a great issue.
But it's I think what Mr. Lowell was saying is that it's the effect of that on the perceptions of homelessness amongst other young people. Is that
Yeah,
correct?
exactly.
Yeah. Because it's still there.
Okay. Did Jenny from Wales want to add something to that point there? Does Wales do anything to educate young people about, the help that's available to destigmatise it, or to do anything else in the way of communications?
We run a service which funded by Welsh Government, an education service, and that goes into the schools around Wales, also pupil referral units as well. The emphasis of that service is about leaving home education, so it's about leaving home in a planned way, and it incorporates, financial literacy and relationships education. It could be expanded, I think, a lot more than it is. It's a very small service at the moment. We have lobbied in the past to ask for leaving home education to be part of the curriculum in Wales. That wasn't successful. Obviously, the curriculum, as I'm sure is the case in England too, is really, really packed. The approach that we found works the best is a peer approach, and so the work that we've done is with teenagers. If you try to deliver it to children who are too young, it's too abstract, they don't get it. But teenagers up to the age of about 21, having quite informal sessions that are led by someone, a young person who has been homeless themselves, and we have found that is the most effective way of really kind of bringing these issues home to young people. So it is a part of the picture in Wales, this kind of early prevention, but I think in an ideal world, it would be a lot higher in the mix than it is.
Okay, thank you very much. To Deborah, then finally, the question is there a role for the Mayor in doing anything to convene education on homelessness, to encourage or support local authorities in what they're doing there?
Yeah, I guess there's one example where the Mayor is already involved in that through the No First Night Out pilot project that's been funded from City Hall, and that's a project that's focused primarily on prevention of rough sleeping, but it's still about sort of prevention, early intervention and so on. And that's a project that's been carried out by Tower Hamlets, City of London and Hackney in partnership. And they've done some really interesting work with community groups like, for example, the East London Mosque. So I think, schools are one really obvious kind of outlet, but certainly in the past I've worked in the local authority housing options service and came up against some of those same problems of kind of full curricula. So I think perhaps there's scope for working with other local authority groups, as the No First Night Out project has been doing. So I guess one thing that some of my colleagues are working on at the moment is working with that project to see how they can disseminate the learning from their work with community groups to other local authorities.
The toolkits are there, so from our previous work we have toolkits that when schools ask we can provide them with sort of exercises they can do with young people, and I know other organisations have similar things. It's just how do we get that out to the people that need it?
Thank you very much. We should move on. David Curtin has some questions asking about the Housing Act in Wales, I think.
Great, thanks. Yeah, I'd like to ask in this section about the Homelessness Reduction Act, which applies to England and London, and also the Housing Act in Wales. And I know in some of your answers already we've alluded to this and talked about some of the impacts it's already having in Wales and what it might do in the future. And I'll start with you, Jenny, in Wales there, because you already mentioned some things about it. But is there anything else that you'd like to say about the Housing Act of 2014 in Wales, and how it works to prevent homelessness, and what has worked in the Act and what hasn't worked. Is there anything else that would be useful to London in what you can say about that?
Of course. I mean, in terms of the impact, I think one of the most striking things, relevant from the point of view of hidden homelessness, is the increases in presentations that we've had since the law changed. So we haven't quite got 2 years of data yet. But in the first year, there was a 26.5% increase in the number of people who were approaching local authorities. Now, we've got 9 months of the second year, but the increase has been even greater and quite striking. 46% more people approaching local authorities in the most recent 9 months that we have data for, compared with the same period the previous year. So the numbers of people keep going up and up. Local authorities record their success rates under prevention and relief and the final duty, and they do seem to be holding relatively steady despite the increased workload and the increased work that councils have to do individually with all of those people with them. So broadly speaking, around 2/3 of people who are threatened with homelessness and go to the local authority have their homelessness successfully prevented. And of course, the standard for assessing successful prevention is higher than it was in the old days when all of this was happening under the old legislation. Most people are not being assisted to stay in their own home, and I think this is something that we all hoped would be higher, because obviously that would be a great result in terms of relieving pressure on the housing system. But so far, it's just under a quarter of people who have a successful prevention outcome are actually assisted to remain in their own home. Most people are going into new tenancies, primarily in the private rented sector. I think that looking at our casework and looking at the research that we've done so far with people, some people are a really excellent service compared to what they would have under the old system, particularly single households. Single people who in the old days would have only been helped under advice and assistance. Some, are getting a much more in-depth level of help than they used to be, and better referrals to support services. That said, we have picked up a clear trend among our clients and the people who we've done research with, for some local authorities to be relying on quite a generic service, quite a generic set of reasonable steps. The standard response seems to be, when someone approaches a local authority now, even if they've got a child, even if they will be a priority need, the standard response now is, here's a list of private landlords, off you go, good luck. And if you manage to find somewhere, then we will help you with the rent in advance, and we will help you with the bond. So the help with the rent in advance, that is new. We wouldn't have had that under the old system. But for some people, this system, the new duty looks very similar to the old advice and assistance duty. And some of these lists that Welsh local authorities are using, the lists of private landlords, are not kept up to date regularly. So we have some people who are, they're told to ring every landlord on the list, and they feel that they have to do that because of the new power to end the duty if someone is found to be, quote, unreasonably failing to cooperate. So this creates a pressure on people to really, to do a lot and be very proactive. Some councils, one council that I'm aware of in Wales is actually requiring people to keep a reasonable steps diary. So this is a kind of, it's similar to a kind of a DWP approach of requiring people to account for the amount of time they spend house hunting. This puts a lot of pressure on people at a time which, during which they're already under a lot of stress. We're quite concerned about a potential limited range of reasonable steps. But I mean, this is, I think, I don't know if you can hear me. I'm getting
yeah. Sorry.
Okay, you can hear me fine. We do still have issues with people dropping out of the system as well, and I think from the point of view of hidden homelessness, again, this is a relevant consideration. About 20% of people who approach Welsh local authorities now, they drop out of the system for one reason or another. About 6% are dropping out because they're being found to be unreasonably failing to cooperate. Most people are withdrawing their application, or they're just losing contact. Now, we don't know enough yet about why that is. Is it because people are managing to sort themselves out? And there's nothing necessarily wrong with that. That's what this whole new legislation encourages people to help themselves. But what if that isn't the outcome? What if people are becoming street homeless and losing contact because they're losing faith in the local authorities' ability to help them? So there are some issues there around dropouts from the system that we need to understand a bit better. And the last point that I'll make as well is that you also have to consider, and of course this will also be an issue when the Homelessness Reduction Act comes in, the proportion of people who get all the way through the system and are assisted under relief, and then they're found to be, that relief interventions aren't successful and they're still homeless at the end of that process, but they're not in a priority need group. And for us, it's 11.9% of people who approach local authorities are subsequently not helped effectively, and they end the process and they're still homeless. Where are they going? So these are questions that we have at the moment, because I think we recognise in Wales that this is a step in the right direction. We used to see an awful lot of people not getting assisted, and now the numbers are fewer, but they are still there. And I do think it needs to be remembered as well that over the last year we've seen substantial increases in rough sleeping in Wales. We don't monitor rough sleeping in a very rigorous way in Wales, I have to say. Data isn't at a strong point, we don't have budgets for that. But the Welsh Government's own statistics suggest that a lot more people are sleeping rough now than they were just a year ago. And in our service, we've seen a lot more people who are rough sleepers coming to shelter summary for assistance. We've seen a 68% rise in 1 year, which is huge for us. So while the system might be good at preventing homelessness, I guess my questions are A, about the sustainability of those prevention outcomes, and B, what about the people who are actually homeless, and particularly if they have significant support needs and are at risk of rough sleeping.
Thank you.
Can I just ask, David, you said you're data light at the moment, but is there an indication of why there's an increase in rough sleeping, particularly any particular demographic group or circumstance that has produced that?
As yet, no.
Oh, okay.
We are trying to persuade Welsh Government to put the money into doing some research. It's a pretty important issue, but no one has fully got to grips with that yet.
Okay, thank you. Thank you,
Can
David.
I just, before we move on to the Homelessness Reduction Act, is it possible, Jenny, that you could outline what requirements there are in the Housing Act in Wales, and what's the difference between that and the Homelessness Reduction Act requirements?
I'm not 100% up to speed on the Homelessness Reduction Act, but my understanding is that it is broadly similar to the duties that we now have in the Housing Wales Act. So in Wales, the definition of threatened with homelessness has been extended to 56 days, which I believe is the same as the Homelessness Reduction Act. There's a new duty on local authorities to help all eligible households with prevention services as long as they are threatened with homelessness. That duty lasts for up to 56 days. Then the relief duty kicks in if households actually become homeless. Then local authorities have up to 56 days to relieve that homelessness. The success rates for that second stage are substantially lower for a variety of reasons. It's easier to prevent homelessness than deal with it once it's happened, of course. We also think that a number of priority households are being kind of fast-tracked through that stage because in order that they get higher points on their allocation system so that they go straight to the final duty. So there's the prevention duty, the relief duty, and then if they're unsuccessful, then the final duty kicks in, which is very similar to the law that you have currently. So that's when local connection and intentionality are considered and priority needs, of course. So that's the system in a nutshell. I think another point which is important to mention is that alongside this legislative change, Welsh Government has pushed a strong culture change agenda, not only with local authorities but also with us and other homelessness agencies. So prior to the law change, I think it's fair to say that there quite an adversarial relationship often between us and local authorities. And Welsh Government were clear that we need to be working more collaboratively. And that's something which I think is, it is a process of change, but it is happening. For example, we do a lot of homelessness prevention work ourselves, particularly technical stuff where it comes to representing people in court, for example, and liaising with private landlords, things that local authorities in Wales weren't that hot on always in the past. So we can work together to help to prevent homelessness now. And some local authorities in Wales have got embedded Shelter Cymru caseworkers now. So local authorities actually fund these places. They're independent, they work for us, but they're there to consult and to advise the local authority on what is and isn't going to pass from a legal perspective. The idea is that we reduce the amount of formal legal challenge that's going on. And of course, there's also a big drive when we talk about culture change. It's not only between us agencies, it's also about the way that we work with individuals. And so people using homelessness services are supposed to have their needs taken into account in a much more meaningful way than under the old system. And part of this has been about personal housing plans, which Shelter Cymru actually invented the concept of personal housing plans going back a very long time now. But all local authorities use these, and they're supposed to be a tool for involving people in defining what housing solutions they want and how to go about getting it. At the moment, they're not really working as intended, I think it's fair to say. Most people just see it as another piece of paper, and the local authorities as well just see it as another piece of paper, and it is in itself quite a bureaucratic system. This is something else that I think that English local authorities have to be very aware of. This multi-stage homelessness process requires you to notify people what stage they're at and what duties they're owed, and that is very paperwork heavy. And some councils are really struggling with this now. So if there are some innovative solutions here around notifying people by text or different ways, or I think that this is worth looking at, because it's something that in Wales we didn't anticipate the level of bureaucracy that this system has brought. And in some ways, that bureaucracy is kind of draining resources away from the primary purpose of helping people. So that's something to consider moving forward.
Sorry, David, I just wanted to check and get that clarification on the legislation. You carry on.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I'll move on to ask Vincent now from Southwark. What do you think are the impacts of the implementation of the Homelessness Act going to be on your housing services in Southwark?
Well, there's the positive impact in terms of clients being, and by the way, I agree 100% with everything Jenny has said. We've experienced that already. More people are being assisted, which is a positive thing. We brought in shelter to our service. The first time we brought them in, it was in 2013, to review our service and kind of tell us where we're failing, where things are not working. And we've had them 2013, 2015, 2017 to just to keep us on our toes and like, okay, what are you not doing properly and all that. And we've been making improvements. Also, like Jenny said, we are looking to bring shelter in to offer an advocacy service to our clients at our reception from September thereabout. We're working on that. So yes, more help for customers. Our officers are happier, and the reason for that is, so prior to when we got this £1 million to fund this trailblazer, it was we take the highest number of homelessness applications in London, and we're the third highest nationally. So last year we had 2,500 homelessness decisions which we made. And we're very, very robust in our decision. We take an application from all our clients coming in through the door. But when we're bringing this in, the questions our officers were asking was, okay, you want to change the process, you want to move us away from being investigators to negotiators, but what products are you giving us to do that with? Which was why we then came up with this list of products which I mentioned earlier, housing first, incentive payments, accommodation service, reconnection officers, resettlement officers, all kinds of products which would help us prevent and relieve homelessness. And that's been good. And we're seeing a culture change amongst officers also, which is more like, okay, yeah, we actually want to help that client instead of issuing a 15-page intentionality decision letter. Let's try to help them. Blind to priority need, blind to intentionality. We've had a few cases. A client came in, £11,000 rent arrears, prevention stage. We've offered him 2 properties. He's declined both. And my officers were like, can we issue the intentionality decision now? I'm like, no, you can't, sorry. This is a new way of working. He's going to move on to relief when he does become homeless, and he's going to come back, and we still need to try to help him. If all of that fails, then we need to consider intentionality right at the end, unlike right now. Something else we had to do was to move away our full assessment officers from the triage pre-assessment stage and put in customer services officers there, because one of the feedback we got from shelter was you need to offer advice and assistance at the earliest opportunity, backed up with good customer service. So when we had our full assessment, which I think you've mentioned already, when we had our full assessment officers right at the door, that was a challenge, because once the client comes in, I'm like, oh, I've been evicted for antisocial behavior, but I need assistance from the council. Straight away in the mind of the officer is like, oh yeah, you made yourself intentionally homeless, and things like that. So we've had to move them away and put customer services officers right at the front so we can gather information, try to provide advice and assistance early. So we feel it's early days, but we feel it's working. We feel there's a culture change among staff. I chair a panel of a subgroup. So we've got a homelessness forum in Sadok. We've got 40 odd organizations coming to that. And within that homelessness forum, we've carved out a group of agencies who hold us to account on our action plan for the Trailblazer. So we meet every quarter, and then they tell us, oh yeah, you've done that, you've not done this. And we've seen better relationships with agencies. They know what to tell clients when they go back to their offices in terms of, okay, this is what Sadok has to offer. So that has worked. The bugbear, the big problem, the big issue we have, or one of the big issues is, of course, the bureaucracy. It's just killing. It's so much to do in terms of the paperwork, what you need to complete, the notification you need to issue, each stage. So previously, prior to November last year, our officers knew that if you have a case, you've got 6 weeks to make your decision and move it on. And that was good. Everyone knew what they needed to do. Now you could have a case, and you could have that case open for 3 months, 6 months, because they've come in at the prevention stage, section 21, you're working with the landlord. If all of that fails, that could last more than 56 days sometimes. It could last up to 100 days. And then it goes to relief stage, you've got 56 days, and then you've got 3 days to make your final decision. And then when you bring in the 7 new reviews, the 7 new appeals, it's going to make it complex and difficult in terms of service provision. And I guess my fear, like Jenny said, is officers then concentrating their efforts on doing all those bureaucratic elements of the work rather than helping the customers. But compared to last year, I'd say, I don't have the figures, but compared to last year, we've seen more preventions, more relief now than we did before. And bottom line is just down to we had more funding to actually help more people.
Yeah, when it comes to funding, do you think that you've had adequate funding to put in place all of the extra things that you need to do to make all of these things happen?
I wouldn't say so, no. But I wouldn't tell you either that I know exactly how much we need. We've seen a spike, we've seen an increase in the number of people coming in through our door. So previously, on average in a month, we had 180 full assessments. Now that's moved up to 240, 260. And we expect that to continue, because the more we speak to our advocates, the more we speak to agencies, the more people know that if you go to startup now, you might actually be assisted. They've got schemes which would help you and all that. The more we expect people to come in through our service. So personally, I'm thinking at the end of this financial year, we'll probably see a 50% increase in the number of people coming in through our doors.
Yeah. But maybe I can move on to Deborah. And do you think that that's the same picture around London as well as we have in Southwark?
Yeah, I mean, I guess Southwark is in the distinctive position of piloting some of the prevention measures that will be required of all local authorities from the point when the Act is implemented. and government are talking in terms of next April, but we don't quite yet know when that will be implemented. So I think Southwark and the other authorities that were involved in that sort of prevention trailblazer work are seeing impacts now that other local authorities aren't seeing. But I think local authorities are in a very difficult position with knowing what the increased demand will be. But certainly those services have already been under sort of very heavy pressure over the last 5 years or so. There has been a big increase in the number of households who are becoming homeless, particularly from the private rented sector. So I think they're likely to see even heavier kind of footfall. And I think there is an issue about what they're able to offer and the risk that there is that sort of heavily bureaucratic kind of seeing people through processes, but that without the funding for services, but without the kind of housing options out there in the housing market, they may struggle and find that resources are kind of going in directions that aren't very helpful. So there's an issue around funding. So government have kind of committed to covering all of the costs resulting from the Act, but the funding that's in place is, sorry, just let me look through notes. 61 million over 2 years for the whole country, and that's based on the assumption that after 2 years the measure will be kind of cost neutral for local authorities. So interesting to hear Jenny saying that from Wales that hasn't proved to be the case, even kind of with 3 years transitional funding. And there was an estimate from London councils that just for London boroughs to implement the measure for 1 year would cost £77 million. So I think there are some real questions about the ability of local authorities to kind of meet the new demands on them, especially in a context where homelessness is rising anyway, and the affordability crisis compounded by welfare reform is making it very difficult to offer substantive options. So kind of, very sort of mixed views really.
Do you think it's particularly difficult in London because of the affordability in the private rented sector?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think in the discussion around the homelessness reduction bill, as it was, there was a lot of looking to Wales and the practice that was being rolled out there. And I think one of the difficulties is that we're looking at a very different kind of context in Wales. So just looking at the size of the population, the supply of social housing and the affordability of private rented sector housing, the context is a very different one. So I don't think we can assume that what's happened in Wales, which hearing from Jenny is obviously, sort of delivered some good things but have run into some problems. I don't think we can assume that we will see the same impacts here from similar legislation.
So London's 3 times the population of Wales, I think, something like of that order, But in terms of bureaucracy, that's something that a lot of you have mentioned. I mean, have you got any ideas, perhaps Jenny or Vincent? Is it possible to streamline and reduce the bureaucracy? Is that something that the government needs to look at, which would make this a lot easier? Or is the bureaucracy that you've got, is it a necessary part of providing the service?
Shall I?
Yes. Yeah, go on first.
So we've been exploring different options around this. The challenge, of course, is that your notifications, they do have to meet the legal requirements set out in the Act. One solution which has been discussed but not got to the stage of piloting yet is, rather than having notification letters going out to people, that you use the personal housing plan itself as the basis of the notifications. So rather than sending a letter to someone to say, you're no longer being helped under prevention, we're now helping you under relief, all you would do is you would update the plan and you would send that back out to them, and also have a conversation with people. I mean, this is something which has come through our research and our casework very clearly, that when people are going through this process, letters and things aren't necessarily what they want. What they want is for someone to be there to support them through this stressful process of being homeless. They want their officer to be available to them if they need to call them for whatever reason, and they want regular contact, not necessarily even if there's any new information to update them with, but just to say we haven't forgotten about you. Because I think one of the worst things for people who are homeless for any length of time is the fear and the stress of being felt that they've been abandoned in temporary accommodation, for example, the feeling that they've been forgotten about. So there's a kind of twin challenge here around communication support and notifications. And I think that there could be some work usefully done to, rather than have letters, to use the plan itself and to keep bringing it back to the plan as the focus of the conversation of the relationship between the officer and the person using the service.
Okay, thank you very much. I've just got one final thing I can just quickly ask everyone is, do you think the Act coming in 2017 will help to gather a more accurate picture of how many people are homeless, particularly hidden homeless? I don't know if anyone wants to say something about that.
It would, whether it will go 100%, I'm not sure. It will start it off. I believe more people will come out. I think they've seen an increase in Wales. We are seeing an increase in Southwark. So clearly, more people are coming out. But I guess where the challenge will be, especially if we're talking about hidden homelessness and we're talking about single people, will be if we can't find them accommodation in the private sector and they can't find accommodation themselves in the private sector. What impact would that have over time? In terms of, I went there and I was, but maybe we're not given a generic list, maybe we're given an incentive payment, but you still can't get the property because of benefit caps, welfare reform, the impact of welfare reform. So for example, 18 to 21-year-olds, some of them won't qualify for the housing element of universal credit or housing benefit, and that would have its own challenge. So you might, with all the will in the world, you want to help them, but if they're not going to get a benefit to pay the rent, how's that going to happen? So I guess over time, we might see an initial surge, but if we don't fix the broken housing market, I fear that maybe in 5 years' time, or I don't know how long, people might then drift back into, what's the point?
Okay, thank you.
That's my fear.
Yeah, thanks. Okay, I think I'm going to have to hand back to the chair as I've
got about 20 minutes left.
Okay.
We did have Tom Copley has some more questions, which actually are a new topic, so I just wanted to make sure we've got enough time for that.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, to Vincent first of all. This is about voids, and often now, whereas in the past, people could access short life housing on a temporary basis. That tends not to happen now. Do you think that the voids allocation process of social housing could be improved?
I think so. Yes, definitely. Yeah, I think the more we're able to bring properties back into use, the better. It will reduce the number of people in temporary accommodation, and it will save us money across board. So yeah.
I mean, where, for example, so in Southwark, you know, where for example, you've got regeneration schemes, and often where there's going to be a regeneration scheme, sometimes people will be put in on a short life tenancy. Is that something that you do with homeless families in Southwark?
Yes.
And do you do that? Sorry, you said that is something you do in Southwark. Okay. What about using better technology to get further efficiencies, such as new real-time logging systems for voids? Sorry, I've got this as a question here. I'm not actually sure what these new real-time logging systems are.
Okay, so it's just apparently it's just technology use in general to get a better idea in real time of where voids are and what voids are coming up,
right.
as opposed to paper systems, which I believe councils currently use at the moment.
I believe, that would be useful. That would be very useful.
How about just moving to Deborah? You know, there's a big emphasis now on encouraging build to rent. It's something that the mayor is very keen on doing. And although, of course, you know that they're not part of the social housing system, this is private housing. Do you think there's a role there potentially for build to rent providers to have where they've got voids, to agree to have homeless families allocated there on a temporary basis?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a tricky one. Clearly, it's really important, given the pressure on London's housing, that we make the very best use of what we got. But I think just looking across the board, where there have been some sort of short-lived systems using voids, say on regeneration estates for temporary accommodation, that hasn't been without its problems. So sometimes families have been moved into estates on a temporary basis, and then there's been a lot of criticism of the local authority for moving them on when regeneration is going ahead. Looking at the build-to-rent sector specifically, I think rents that on the whole are relatively high, and although the Mayor is committed to the build-to-rent sector delivering some affordable housing, I think that's more likely to be at sort of London living rent levels for people in work or perhaps struggling to save for a deposit in the private rented sector, rather than necessarily for homeless families. I think the nature of that sector is that they haven't particularly kind of struggled with voids, because they tend to go for sort of longer term tenancies and security. Although a fuller picture might emerge as that sector becomes more established. But I do think build to rent can have some indirect positive effects for homeless households, because I think one of the issues that homeless households and the local authorities seeking to assist them have faced in recent years is a really kind of fierce competition within the private rented sector from a much wider kind of cohort of Londoners than might previously have lived in that sector, because home ownership is becoming increasingly unaffordable and people are moving kind of further out. A tenancy that might once have gone to a kind of low income family facing homelessness will now kind of have a far wider selection of Londoners competing for it. So I think insofar as build to rent has potential to relieve some of the pressure on the private rented market, it can indirectly help homeless households.
Right, so because there's these new, so people will move into those and then free up homes in the amateur landlord sector potentially. So
yeah, I wouldn't necessarily want to look
but,
at it that way.
The landlord that owns one or two properties rather than the institutional landlord.
Yeah, and I think local authorities are reporting real difficulties securing tenancies for households who are facing homelessness, whether that's as kind of formal temporary accommodation or as kind of a bid to kind of intervene earlier on and to prevent households from moving into temporary accommodation.
And what about the role of a potential role for the Mayor here? So could there be, for example, some sort of London-wide allocation system which the Mayor could coordinate?
For social housing or for?
I think this is under sort of build to rent.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that most build-to-rent landlords are private companies who are kind of having no difficulty kind of securing tenants. I think for London Living Rent, there is potential for a system that looks a bit more like the kind of First Steps website, where there is a pan-London approach.
Okay.
Can I ask one further question about the supply of homes that might be able to be used to help fulfil the Homelessness Reduction Act duties? I don't know if Southwark are doing any of this, and I'd be interested to know, because you're in a London borough, basically. I went to visit Enfield, where they had a forum for landlords, and they were outlining their new packages that they were going to offer to landlords as an incentive to get them to take more people who were on housing benefits who were referred to them by the council. And it was things like trying to get them to trade off a security of having somebody there all the time, where the council would guarantee void periods against the lower rent. And is Southwark trying to do any of that to bring down the costs it will face? And how are you getting on? Because it's a different market than Enfield, I imagine.
It is, yeah. February, March, April, and probably May, we met with, because this sits under my remit, we met with, I think it must have been about 20 or 25 of our biggest providers of temporary accommodation as a council. And basically our discussion with them was we need to move away from this nightly led costly accommodation to more settled accommodation and shorter tenancies. And initially the answer was no, it's too risky because for all the other forms of accommodation, the council pays on behalf of the tenant. Temporary accommodation we pay, so the income is guaranteed. But where you have a short-shuttle tenancies, the council is not involved in that. That's done by housing benefit or universal credit, so it's a lot riskier for landlords. But then having those conversations, we were then like, okay, so what can we do? What will make you happy? What will make you give your properties to us on a settled basis? And it was things around guarantee the rent through rent guarantee scheme, maybe have an insurance in place which will ensure that we don't lose out. So things like that. It was ongoing support they were asking for. So I know most borrowers will pay an incentive, and once the tenant's in the property, that's it, done. But now the landlords are asking us for ongoing support even after we've placed clients into the property. They were asking for a one-stop shop type of arrangement where if they've got any issues with the council, either with the planning department, environmental and health, private tenancies or procurement, just one officer will be able to deal with all of those issues. They were asking for bond scheme for disrepair, so the client trashes the property and the council will pay. And those are the kind of products we are putting together. So now we're coming up with two products. Some landlords just want the money, the incentive payment. And what we're coming up now in Sadok, what we're coming up with is we could pay you, let's just say £3,000, and we give you tenants, tenant moves into your property, and end of story. The relationship is between the tenant and the landlord, which is the way it's meant to be. Or we could pay you £2,000 or £1,500 and offer all this wraparound service with the tenancy. And it's for landlords then to choose which one they would go for. So those are the kind of things we're doing. We have a regular landlord forum in Sadok where we bring them together and we keep challenging one another. How do we move things forward? How do we make things work? So yes, we've got the products, yes.
Okay, and is that successful in bringing more landlords into the fold?
Landlords are listening to us, yeah, and they're offering us properties. And once we identify what kind of products will work, we present that based on the landlord's request, and then we'll house more people, yes.
Okay. Thank you very much. Does anyone else have any more questions? Okay, so I think that is the end of our discussion with the guests. Can I thank all of you for your contributions, especially, but also all of you especially, but also Jenny for doing this via Skype, which can't have been easy. We have a few very short bit of formal business on the agenda, if you wouldn't mind waiting while we do that. So can I ask the committee to agree the recommendations and delegate authority to me as chair to agree any output arising from this discussion? Thank you very much. Item 7 on the agenda, can the members note the initial priorities for our work programme for the 2017-18 Assembly year as set out in paragraphs 4.1 to 4.14 of the report under item 7? Thank you. The next meeting of the Housing Committee is Tuesday the 4th of July, quite soon, at 10 a.m. In Conference Room 4 here, and there we will be starting to discuss property. Community-led housing, that is correct, community-led housing. And item 9, there is no urgent business today, so thank you very much. Meeting.
Well done.
No.